there, welcome to Long Distance Review, and on this week's episode I'm going to look at the new album from Hayley Williams, which is entitled Petals for Armour. You might have noticed I'm sat down on this week's episode. I've realised that the ceiling's quite low in here and I almost cut my head off on the edit, so I thought I'd try and set down, so let's see how this one goes. Anyway, back to the review. Hayley Williams, Petals for Armour. We all know Hayley Williams as the lead vocalist in pop-punk outfit Paramore. And that was a band who she formed when she was very, very young. She was about 14 when they formed. I think the debut album came out when she was about 16 years old. Paramore have themselves changed their sound from the early days of pop-punk right up to the later days on, say, the last album, After Laughter, which contained a lot more new wave, synth pop, disco almost, than any of the sort of punk from the early days. So I think she's carried on that sound onto this album as a forewarning if you think she's gone back to her punk roots. By her own admission, I think she says her early work is maybe inexperienced and contains youthful exuberance more than creative craft. So I think that this as a solo output has a much more creative effort from her than ever before. She admitted to suffering from depression, and in 2015 had a big bout of depression which made her leave Paramore for a brief period of time. And I think this album was kind of born from that, or the idea of the album was born from that. And she actually wrote it last year in Paramore's hiatus after a long tour. She wrote it in 2019. It does contain the guitarist from Paramore, Taylor York, throughout the album, but really the sound of the album is nothing like Paramore. Certainly nothing like the early days of Paramore, maybe something similar to the later days, but it has a very distinctive sound to it compared to Paramore, let's say. It's a pop album. As an overview, it's a pop record. Much more into it, but it's a pop album. The album is almost a concept album, let's say. It's 15 tracks long, but split into three parts of 5 tracks. And they were released as EPs separately. So I'm going to review it as EPs, but as an album as well, if you know what I mean. The EPs were split into parts. The first part was meant to represent rage. The second part was meant to represent resilience, and the last part represented redemption. And I think as a concept, actually, this works really, really well. Each part, not only lyrically but musically, echoes the narrative around it. So on to the review. On part 1, it opens up with a track called Simmer, which was released before the album. And straight away, gone are the neon fluorescent colours that Paramore exude throughout their music, and it's a much more dark and intimate affair. It's much more laid bare, I feel, than anything Paramore will ever put out. It feels intimate, basically. Musically, it has this real nice groove to it that I really enjoyed and almost seduces the listener in. The bass work on this album is really good. The bass production throughout this album is excellent, actually. Has this real throbbing bass behind that track.
When I least expect it, giving control. There's so many ways to give in. Eyes closed. Another way to make it didn't know how to draw the line between wrath and mercy. Gotta simmer, 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 simmer down. Control. There's so many ways to give in. Eyes closed. Another way to make it didn't know how to draw the line between wrath and mercy. Gotta simmer, 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 simmer down.
The bass work, like I say, across the album is stellar, actually. I may as well mention that now. I think if you look at the second track, a track called Leave It Alone, it could be a real minimalistic track, but has this really good bass work on it that carries the track almost. The reflective and minimalistic feel of a lot of these tracks could become tiresome, but Hayley Williams sort of has a couple of intimate tracks and then puts a more funkier, upbeat song in between. And on the first part of that song is a song called Cinnamon that I really, really liked. It starts off quite delicate, but then builds up to this real funky, toe-tapping number. I enjoy the uncomfortable and offbeat melodies that Hayley Williams puts throughout this record, and it is much more comparable to bands like Christine and the Queens than it is to any of the Paramore stuff, I feel. The lyrical nature and narrative of the album is basically Hayley Williams laying herself bare for all to see. It's a catharsis, it's a release, it's a celebration of who she is. It's an admission of her own faults and frailties and her depression. And for someone who has basically grown up in front of our eyes and is still very, very young, is a bold and brave creation. And not only is it commendable, it's actually very credible as an artist, I feel. Part 2 of the album, the middle section of the album, is a much more poppier affair than the darker first part, and opens up with a song called Dead Horse, which has this almost Jamaican dance rhythm in it that I can't say I enjoyed, but it was definitely highly infectious. Hayley's vocals on this album are really, really good. There's no surprise in there, she's an incredible vocalist, but I like on this album how her vocals come across much more airy and delicate feel to it. Check out a song called My Friend, which showcases her real vocal abilities. I think the poppier side of the album is where it doesn't work as well for me. There's a song called like Over Yet, which steals almost like a Girls Aloud rhythm, reminds me of a Girls Aloud song mixed with this 80s synth pop, which just comes across as a bit jarring for me. Although that track is followed up by probably my favourite track on the album, a track called Roses, Lotus, Violet and Iris, which has this gloriously confident swagger over this beautiful strings and a bouncing sort of throbbing bass line that I really, really enjoyed.
Roses, 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 roses. Show no concern for colors of a violet. Lotus, 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 lotus.
The third and final part of the album is much more R&B based than anything before, and I think is the weakest section of the album. It opens up with a song called Pure Love, which could have been lifted from one of Michael Jackson's early albums, like Off the Wall or something. And that's followed up by a song called Taken, which has a very similar flavour to it. And although I don't think standing alone they're terrible songs, I just feel like it has a bit of a jarring feel to it compared to the much more earlier, darker, intimate pieces of work. There's a dance song on that part, like a dance floor number called Sugar on the Rim, which doesn't really work that well for me either. It kind of sacrifices Hayley's vocals for a dance beat and a much more manufactured pop sound to it. Although the last part is thankfully redeemed by the beautiful closing track entitled Crystal Clear, which has this lovely, airy, bouncy, delicate feel to it and these redemptive lyrical arc. Yeah, I really like that track, thought it was excellent. Overall, this is a very confident and bold album from someone who's grown up in the spotlight. It focuses on her own narrative, her own mental health, her own future in a way, and I think it carries an important message throughout the album, a message of growth, of strength, of feminism, of an admission of someone's own vulnerabilities and being okay with that. Not all of it works that well for me. I think as an album it would have been better if it had been shorter and more concise, but I think as 3 separate EPs they all stand alone on their own pretty well, and I think the first EP is excellent. But saying that, I think this is a much more interesting and diverse and experimental album than I ever expected from Hayley Williams. I think out of all the 15 songs there's probably 6 or 7 I think are really good. There's probably 2 or 3 that I'll never listen to again, and then there's, a few okay ones, and that's pretty decent for me. This is a different kind of album than I usually review, so I hope people are sort of open-minded and give it a listen, because I think it's worth it. Anyway, let me know what you think of the Hayley Williams album entitled Petals for Armour, and I'll be back soon with another review. Thanks for watching.